Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev, where today we learn. Now, by sheer coincidence, a lot of the stuff we've been working on recently here on Let's Dev could really make use of GameMaker's tiling system. But since the drastic change in Studio 2, I've not been able to really grasp how it works. Today that changes, because not only will we learn how tiles work in GameMaker Studio 2, but we'll also use them. We'll even create a very basic quote-unquote game out of the ordeal, and I'll be sure to provide explanations for all of it in case any of you out there have been struggling as well. So let's not waste any more time and get to the tiling. Now, first thing, make sure a tile layer exists in the game room. Then it's really as simple as adding two variables. The first will identify the tile layer itself. This layer can also be created via code, but I decided to do it manually via the room editor. The second variable identifies the tile map that will be used. In this case, I'm using the same map I selected when I created the tile layer. Then a few more variables would be needed for our project. We'd need a DS grid the size of our room divided by the size of our tiles, which in this case are 8 by 8. Then for the entire width and height of the room, a default tile would be drawn. In this case, the default tile is a deep water tile. And let's pause here real quick to explain how tiles are placed, at least in the context of today's project. Tiles can only be drawn on a tile layer. And since we're drawing tiles based on a grid, that layer needs to be broken down into, well, a grid. Placing tiles this way is very strict in that positions aren't measured by literal pixels, rather they are measured by cells. So since our cells/tile size is 8 by 8, if we want a tile to be displayed at 40 by 40 in the room, we'd use 5 by 5 as the tile placement coordinates. So not only would we use the grid measurements to draw some tiles, but we'd also set the DS grid data to default values. Then two variables for the mouse were added. In the step event, these variables would keep track of the nearest grid cell based on the mouse's position, which was then drawn so we could keep track of where we were placing tiles. And so far things were going smoothly. Our default deep water tile was drawn over the entire space of the room, and our mouse position checks were on point. So now it was time to get to the fun stuff. Two new variables were added for a current tile and a next tile, to make this more of a game like a Dr. Mario or Tetris. These tiles were drawn on the screen, and before continuing I had the last minute idea to add tools to the pool of random tiles to further test our tile manipulation potential. A shovel for contextual tile switching, and a hammer thing for destroying tiles. Then back to the code, checking for a left click, it was time to get to the good stuff. First up was checking for a grid cell via the mouse position. If the cell's value is the default value and our tile is not a tool, then the cell is updated. First, the tile image is swapped to the current tiles, then the DS grid data is updated to reflect the change. The current tile becomes the next tile, and a new tile is randomly selected. And aside from accidentally including the blank tile in the tile pool, this was a success. Tiles could be placed but not replaced, and nothing broke or crashed the game. So after removing the blank tile from the pool, it was time to work on the shovel. Using a switch, the shovel would replace a tile based on certain conditions. So grass would become dirt, dirt would become mud, and so on. Though the context of most of the tile changes didn't make sense in reality, it was fine because this was purely for testing purposes. Then for the hammer, regardless of what tile it's based on, the values for both tile and grid data are reset to their default values. The results were positive, with shovel and hammers acting like they should. It made for some interesting ways to handle a tile that the player didn't need. But ultimately I decided to nix the tools to test something less familiar. I wanted to try figuring out a way to do position checks via tile or grid data. And as far as I could tell, there wasn't anything really built in. So I did it the old-fashioned way with 4 directional checks for adjacent tile data. I then tried to clamp the data to prevent it from checking for data that didn't exist, only to realize that this probably wasn't going to work regardless. So I decided to call it a day there. All in all, I was able to learn that tiles aren't as confusing as GameMaker makes them out to be, but there's definitely a lot more to them than in previous versions, something I've already begun researching in my free time. And in case you're curious as to why it's important to learn about tiles instead of simply drawing sprites as I have been with recent projects, the answer is simply for performance purposes. For example, drawing 10 tiles can be done in one instance, but 10 sprites would need to be drawn individually. And over time, that extra effort will start to really hurt a game's performance. Anyway, I'm glad I finally sat down and learned this stuff, but no thanks to the documentation, by the way, which really does a horrible job of explaining the basic actions of using tiles. It literally takes like maybe 3 bits of code to draw a tile in a room, but the documentation makes it seem like it's much more complicated than that. And on top of that, almost every example provided basically uses the same exact example. So if the context of one example doesn't make any sense, none of the provided examples make any sense. I don't know why the extra optional stuff is their default go-to examples, but I kinda wish they would stop it. But what's done is done, and hopefully it's smooth sailing from here on out, and hopefully our projects can now prosper from the new bit of information learned here today. However, for now, that brings us to the end of this little experiment and today's episode of Let's Dev. So leave a like if you enjoyed the episode, subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already, and leave your thoughts on tile implementation in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.